Hi, Julie here. One of the things I'm on a quest for is to bring my 20 years of community building, 13 years of motherhood, and decade of coaching to you through one-on-one coaching and a new signature offer, the Mother's Quest Circle. If you are on the threshold of something big and you'd like inspiration, coaching, and community on your journey, visit mothersquest.com/mothers-quest-circle to learn more and apply. Now, on to the show. Hi, and welcome to Mother's Quest, a podcast for moms like me ready to live our own truly epic life. I'm Julie Neal, a life and leadership coach, community builder, writer, and mom to two high-energy boys who challenge me to grow into my best self. I'll be right there. Where was I? In the months leading up to a big milestone birthday, I decided it was time to stop sidelining my dreams and realize that I'm the hero of my own journey. I knew I didn't want to do it alone, so I created this podcast to learn from other moms on their own quest, so their words of wisdom and lessons learned could help light the way for mine. I created this podcast for myself. Come along with me, and you'll find some treasures of your own. Hello, and welcome to episode number 28 of the Mother's Quest podcast that I'm bringing to you at the start of the Jewish New Year. The holiday kicks off a 10-day period known as the Days of Awe, between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. This time of year, regardless of your religious faith, is a season of reflection and renewal, as our children get settled into a new school year and the leaves begin to change color. I wanted to take advantage of this time to turn inward and create an opportunity for change, not only for myself, but also for members of the Mother's Quest community. I decided to reach out to mindful mother Edie Rafael Brotman, author of the book Mussar Yoga, to learn from her how she approaches self-improvement through blending the ancient Jewish practice of Mussar and the ancient Eastern practice of yoga. Edie's book was a trusted resource in a Mussar class I took a few years ago. I was enthralled by the process and know that the experience planted seeds for Mother's Quest. So when I reached out to Edie to see if she'd share her approach on the podcast and then lead a 5-day challenge in the Facebook group, and she said yes, I was thrilled. Edie is a workplace consultant and coach for a business consulting firm called Rewire Inc. that leverages emotional intelligence, mindfulness, and communication. She has her PhD in sociology and was an adjunct professor at UVA, Case Western Reserve University, and Towson University. She's also a highly trained yoga instructor, was named one of Baltimore's favorite yoga teachers in Baltimore Magazine's Best of Baltimore, and co-founded Off the Grid Yoga and Camping Retreats. Before I share more about my conversation with Edie, I want to introduce Mara Burns-Langer with this week's dedication.
Thank you, Julie, for letting me dedicate this episode of the Mother's Quest podcast. Julie and I met through a Mussar class we took together a couple of years ago. It's through the Mussar class that I learned the traits of a commitment to self-improvement and a commitment to courage. I want to dedicate this episode to my girlfriend, Tracy Stetner. Tracy exhibits both of these, courage and a commitment to self-improvement. She's continually looking for ways to improve her knowledge and her parenting skills to make life a better place for her 2 sons and her family. She's gone so far as to take a year abroad in London to live the life of an Englander and to face the world from another perspective. I'd also like to take this opportunity to dedicate this podcast to my own mother, Joan Acarino. She walks the talk and is always looking for ways to make life a better place.
Thank you, Mara, for that lovely dedication for your friend and your mother, who both exemplify character traits that we explore in Mussar practice. These character traits, known in Hebrew as midot, are the centerpiece of Mussar practice. Edie and I explore her epic life story how she came to mindfulness and Mussar, and how reflecting on Midot in her life has enriched her and her relationships. Edie also shares how her mother influenced her independence, and how her untimely death jump-started Edie's journey to find Mussar Yoga as a bridge to connect Jewish spirituality and her love for physical activity. I loved this conversation with Edie, especially the deep dive into the history of Mussar practice, and how she came to this connection between self-improvement, spirituality, and the physical body. I'm so excited to continue the exploration of all these things, and hope you'll decide to come along too, as we challenge ourselves together during this season of reflection and renewal. I'm Julie Neal, and this is Mother's Quest. So, Edie, welcome to the Mother's Quest podcast. It's such an honor, and I'm just so excited to have you here today.
I'm really excited to be here too. Thank you for inviting me.
I like to share a little of the backstory for how different guests come on the podcast. So this is an exciting one for me. A couple of years ago, I wanted to be more mindful getting ready for the Jewish holidays. So Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which always happen at the beginning of the school year. And my temple was offering a special learning experience for a practice called Mussar, which I had never heard of before. And it ended up being a really transformational experience for me and started me doing a morning practice, which I think is part of, I talk about planting seeds for Mother's Quest, but I know that there were many seeds for Mother's Quest planted just through having that more mindful experience that I was having in the morning and some of what came from that initial Mussar exploration. And we're going to get into some more about what this Mussar mystery is. But in that class, the rabbi that was working with us often shared pieces from your book, Mussar Yoga. And I just thought, what an amazing thing that, this author, who I now have the privilege of talking with live, brought together these two practices. And the book was a great resource for our class. So when I was thinking, as Mother's Quest has evolved of, getting ready for the Jewish holidays again this year, how I wanted to get more present, I thought of you and reached out to you and was excited about this idea of even doing a meaningful and deep challenge inside the Mother's Quest Facebook group, as I had done with Lindsay McCarthy, who's the author of The Miracle Morning for Parents and Families. And you said yes. So this is the beginning of a lot more to come, and I'm just so excited to start it all off.
Wonderful. Yeah. It's interesting. You're talking about the fall and the Jewish holiday. It's the Jewish New Year coming up. And it just reminds me so much of how much I love the Jewish holidays and how much I love fall, because it's this combined idea that there's a sense of newness, the school year starting, but also it's a turning inward. In fall, I was just talking to someone today. She was saying, I love how the leaves are dying, everything's dying. And she sort of laughed, but there's something true. It's this moment of a sense of new. And at the same time, we're a kind of a turning inward. We're starting to pay attention to this parts of ourselves that are really deep within in a way that we don't, I feel like, in the spring in the same way. So it's a season of reconnecting and cultivating some really wonderful practices and a sense of renewal.
I love that. There is so much wisdom in nature and also in ancient practices, which we're going to get, start to talk more in depth about. So I'm so excited that we can share this with my community. And before we pressed record, you and I both set some intentions, and you shared this intention that you just named about wanting people to feel hopeful about the potential of renewal and this time of the year. And the intention that I shared, which I want to name, is that I really want people to feel like what we're discussing and what we're going to invite people to be a part of is something that anybody of any faith, or even if you don't have a religious faith, can access and really get a lot from. So even though we're going to be talking about Jewish practices and Eastern practices and how they come together, this really is something that I think anybody who's wanting that experience of renewal and some self-reflection can access.
Absolutely. When I lead Mussar Yoga classes here in Baltimore, I've had people who are not Jewish very enthusiastically join and participate and feel like they've gotten a lot out of. So it truly is a practice for anyone, in the same way that yoga is as well.
Yes. So let's get started with our interview. The first question I always like to ask is, what was your childhood like? Tell me a little bit about the way you grew up and how your experience with your own mother has shaped who you are today.
Yeah, well, my childhood it's sort of a point of reference in sort of how the whole world has changed. I think of like funny things like how when I was in preschool, that all the little kids, we would take a taxi to our preschool. The taxi would come around and pick us all up. And I remember like none of us had seatbelts on, and we would sit in those jump seats. And so it just is always, I find as I get older, it's just always amazing to me how much the world has changed. So I think about my childhood that way. My mother and I think we had, in some ways, a typical mother-daughter relationship. We butted heads a lot. I think we both had really forceful personalities, so we would always find things to disagree with about. But my mom she was very smart. I think I inherited a lot of her intellectual curiosity from her, and way of looking at the world, always asking questions and trying to understand. And I probably think it's because of my mother that I became a sociologist. But the other thing that I think is really relevant about my mom's story, about my story to what you do, Julie, is that my mother went to law school when I was in fourth grade. And so I imagine this was in the early 70s. And not only were there not a lot of women in law school, but there certainly weren't a lot of women who had kids who were in law school. There were intended to be women who had just come out of their undergrad experience. And so that was really interesting. It was interesting to be a kid whose mom was working at a time when most of my peers' moms were not, for her to be in school. And so I think a lot of degrees she was on the vanguard, and a woman who had gone from being a teacher. She was a French and Spanish teacher, very gifted at languages, and then decided to, after she had my younger sister, and my sister got settled in her school, my mother decided to go back and become a lawyer and work with my father, who was a lawyer as well.
I find that so interesting on this topic of renewal, and something you and I were also talking about before we hit record about, it's never too late to start again. What do you think prompted her to make that choice at that point?
I don't know why she decided to not go back into teaching. I think that she wanted to be independent. She wanted to have her own source of income, and she was not content and didn't enjoy being at home and being a stay-at-home mom. And so something that I can relate to, like, I think we should create more safe space for women to say, hey, you know what, staying at home and taking care of kids is not my cup of tea. It's a really hard job. So she, I think, had the courage to admit that, and had the drive and the desire to do more and to be more engaged intellectually. And she saw what my father was doing, and she thought it was really neat what he did. And I think she was starting to meet a few other women lawyers through him, a woman lawyer that was working with him. And so I think this is what motivated her to go and do it.
So I'm curious now to hear what you think the impact was on you of seeing your mom choose a career while she was raising her children. And what is the path that you've then chosen for your own life and your own career?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that for me, watching my mother go back to work, it certainly made me very independent and proudly independent. So I remember the year before she went to law school, she was taking courses to prepare herself to take the LSATs. And so I must have been in third grade, and my sister was in kindergarten. I remember she brought us down to the basement, taught us how to sort laundry and do all these things on our own. And then, we also, from a young age, even before she had this plan, she was teaching us how to make our own breakfast. And I could make scrambled eggs when I was in kindergarten. And I remember proudly telling my friends. So I feel like there was always a part of her that was preparing us to be independent, and even more so than we needed to be, because I think one of the differences between now and then was that it was a lot easier for her to find and afford a lot of help on the home front. So we always had somebody who was at the house who made dinners and did laundry and all of that. And so when I look back on her experience versus what I see for women today, I think that other than confronting social norms, which has gotten easier for women who work, a lot easier, I think it's harder on every other front. It's harder on the logistics and the time management. I think my mom had that a lot easier than almost any woman I know today.
And so what are you on a quest for today, these days, and in this coming together of your passions and purpose in the world, but also your motherhood?
Well, my kids are older now. And I think, unlike my mom, I was a little bit more patient and waiting for the right moment for my kids to hop into the work world. My kids are a little bit older now. My son is just graduated from high school and my daughter is in 10th grade. So they're able to be more independent. And so that's helpful. And I think that that was important to me, to be around a little bit more than she was, not to criticize her because I feel like we did fine. I just personally wanted to be there, to be available to them more than she was. And I feel like I had to be. My husband had a schedule that was not, he was a doctor and worked at a hospital and had zero flexibility. And so I felt like I couldn't. I mean, interestingly, my father was a really invested dad. He used to come to a lot of the school events. He would show up and watch me play field hockey and be like the only dad there. So there was just an interesting, like there was some gender role fuzziness in a good way. My dad loved to cook. So anyway, so for me, it's just, this has worked out that I've really started to step into pursuing my passion and my career a little bit later than my mother did. And that's worked out really well for me.
I think that it makes sense to move into the epic guideposts now, and we can dig in a little bit more. And, the premise of Mother's Quest is that as moms, we can live what I call our epic life, where we really are the author of our story and can go on our own hero's journey, even in the years, and especially in the years when we're raising our children, and how when we do that, we can actually show up as a more powerful mom. And then, so epic connotes that idea of being on our own heroic journey in our lives. But also then EPIC is an acronym mnemonic for the guideposts, I think, to help us live that life when we're raising our children. So the first one, E, stands for engaged, and that's about being engaged mindfully with our children. What do you think are the ways that you have found, that you can most be present and engaged with your kids?
I think the best thing that I have done as a mother for my kids is to practice mindfulness, is to have a regular daily meditation practice. I think that my kids, since I've become more dedicated to that practice, my kids experience me as a more mindful parent, that I'm conscious and aware of my emotions. I can tell them, hey, this conversation is starting to upset me. Or like I let them know, hey, I'm trying to we're lost right now. And so I can't really respond to you until I figure out, if we're in the car, I can't respond to you until I know that I know where I'm going. Rather than my frustration, I used to get more frustrated. Like I wanted to listen. I wanted to be that parent who would, listen, and I'm totally available and I'm going to be here for you. But then confront the reality of like, I'm starting to panic because I'm getting lost and we're running late. That I'm just so much more mindful and more peaceful. So I can feel the emotions as they begin to arise, and then let my kids know, okay, this is what I'm feeling right now. And that's been really helpful for them, because then they mimic that and they say, oh, I'm starting to get upset. And so we just become like really mindful together and might really good at sharing what our feelings are and before we lose our cool or before we get upset. So it's really helpful.
Yeah, that sounds like such an amazing tool. It's something I think I've been getting better and better at. First just being aware, and then just the power of naming it. That's such a great example too of how it shows up for you, even if you're in the car trying to get somewhere. I am curious to go back a little bit. How did you originally come to this path of mindfulness?
So it came through yoga. And my story with yoga is very strange in some way. I tried my first yoga class when I was in graduate school, and I have no idea what prompted me to go. This was a while ago. This was not when it was a really popular fad. I was in Charlottesville, Virginia. There was one yoga studio. I think I was in my mid-20s. I think everyone else there was in their mid to late 40s or 50s. And in my mind, I just sort of remember this yoga studio. It felt like I was in the I Dream of Jeannie bottle. There were just pillows all over the place. I don't know, flowy things. This is just how I remember it. And I hated it. I really did not like yoga. I was just a person, spent a lot of time at the gym in grad school. So I was not flexible. And this just didn't appeal to me at all. And so that was my first experience. And then from there, I got married and I moved to Baltimore with my husband, and he did residency here. And they started offering yoga at the gym. And I don't know, again, I went to it and still didn't like it, still was with mostly middle-aged men, and just didn't feel like I fit in and didn't really work for me. And then I got pregnant and the teacher didn't know what to do with me. There wasn't pregnancy yoga back then. So I quit yoga. And then fast forward a few years later, we were then living in Cleveland, and I was actually taking ballet classes at the local JCC and really enjoying that because I had done ballet when I was a child a lot. So one day, one of the women in the class said, "You really got to try this yoga class." And I'm like, "Oh, no, I've tried yoga. It's not for me." And she said, "No, this, I think you'll really like. This is a really special class." And so I went and I fell in love. It was a more power, more athletic kind of yoga. My teacher, a woman named Tammy Schneider, who is still my favorite teacher of all times. And I just continued to practice with her. And she really taught me about the power of mindfulness. And I began to see its effects immediately when I really started focusing on being mindful. And so ever since then, I've been an absolute fan and an advocate for mindfulness.
I love the story too, because it just speaks to that idea of like, again, it's never too late. You know, you may have a sense of something not being for you. And then when the time is right, or with the right teacher, you can often find that there's a lot of value.
Absolutely. It's never too late.
So that will inspire anybody listening who has maybe felt in the past that yoga or meditation is not for them.
Right. And even your mindfulness practice, it's taken me a very long time to get a regular and consistent practice. And so you just keep, you never throw in the towel. You just, maybe it's not now, or you can, just say, "Oh, I didn't meditate today, but there's tomorrow," right? And so that's what it's all about. That's what our mindfulness is about. It's what our Mussar is about, our yoga practice. It's all just being patient and being hopeful.
Well, let's move into the next guidepost, P, which stands for passionate and purposeful. And this is about the work in the world that's beyond our family, the ways in which we want to make a difference. What do you feel like is your purpose and passion? And if you can begin to also share how that brought you to Mussar and the way in which you bring Mussar to the world.
Yeah, my passion is so vague, but it's just the underlying thread through everything I do. I really, truly want to make the world a better place. And whatever I've done has been really with that passion in the deepest part of my commitment and engagement. Before I was practicing Mussar and writing a book about Mussar Yoga, I was teaching sociology at various colleges. I enjoyed teaching, but what I really enjoyed was working with students and getting to know them individually and helping them manage this transition to adulthood that happens in college. And just working, when you're teaching at some colleges, you get to meet all different kinds of people and different ages and different stages in their life. And so that to me, though I enjoyed standing up and giving people information and having them look at the world in a different way than they had before, which is also fun. But my passion was that the way of looking at the world and the way that they would engage with me would be helpful to them and to make the world better and more peaceful and compassionate.
And so then how did you come to Mussar and the creation of blending Mussar and yoga?
Yeah, that's sort of a longer story, but I'm happy to share kind of the highlights of it. I had been looking for a long time, a very long time, to have a more meaningful Jewish experience. I think that like a lot of us, we are Jewish because our parents were Jewish and we went to religious school. We had a Passover Seder. We celebrated Hanukkah, but I wasn't entirely sure, speaking for myself, about what was I really supposed to get out of this. And there were two things that happened simultaneously. One was that my mother actually died. She died when she was just about to turn 52. And so there's a whole nother story there because I will be turning 52 at the end of this year, and our birthdays were a week apart. So it's a really interesting, it's a time where I just am cultivating a lot of gratitude and sort of thinking about, how precious life is. But so my mother died. So that kind of launched me on, I think I was just turned 23. She died in between my birthday and hers. So I just turned 23. She was about to turn 52. And so it's just sent me on a real journey, a very spiritual journey to try and kind of pick up the pieces. And I was trying to kind of figure what's the meaning, like what's the point of being Jewish? And I'd always been really physically active. And so the two of them were like completely separate tracks. Like there was the spiritual side of me and there was this like really physically active side. And I didn't even think about connecting them until it was years and years later when I was living in Cleveland and I was practicing yoga regularly. And I really started to understand the spirituality of yoga and really began to feel very deep understanding of the connection between the physical body and the spiritual body, right? They're not two separate things. And once I began to understand that connection, I wanted to find some way of connecting my Jewish spirituality with my physical body, my yoga practice. And so that took me a really long time. It wasn't until many years later, about 7 years later, that I happened upon Mussar and thought, okay, this is how you do it. This is how you build that bridge. And so that's where Mussar Yoga came from.
And so I'd love to hear you talk more about, what is Mussar and how are the ways that you, through your book and through your practice, have been able to connect Mussar and yoga?
Yeah. So Mussar is, I don't think I would just have described it this way until recently, but it is, in essence, it is a way of rewiring your brain. And it's rewiring your brain so that it's in alignment with very universal ethical precepts. And so it's like talked about, like, this is not, if you look at like what we're doing in Mussar, I mean, you can so find connections with Eastern practices, with Christianity, probably with Islam. They're just universal. And so, we're aligning our brains, aligning in a way that we're pursuing truth or pursuing humility. We're pursuing equanimity. And so again, these are all things that I think any system of religion, any spiritual religious tradition can nod their head at and go, yeah, that's a good spiritual life.
One of the things I was fascinated about when I started to learn about Mussar, it sounded like the concepts and the practices of it sounded like something that was very new age, that would, have come out in recent years. And when I learned about how long ago Jewish rabbis were teaching this and the practice has been carried forward from all these generations, it really blew my mind. Can you share a little bit about the history of how it started and how it's evolved?
Happily. So Mussar, right, it does have really ancient origins. So it started in the first few centuries and was practiced by people mostly alone. Like they would practice by themselves, and it was not something that was done in groups. And it really flew under the radar. It was not widely practiced, but there was an ongoing tradition, and there were texts that people referred to throughout the centuries as they would practice Mussar. It begins to really take off around the same time, actually, that Kabbalah or Kabbalism begins to take off. So this is in Spain in around the 1300s and 1400s. There are some wonderful texts that are written then, and so people become more conscious of it. And it gets actually linked. There's some link with Kabbalism. Then there's, fast forward a few centuries, another text is written in the 1700s in Western Europe by a brilliant, brilliant man. It's called The Path of the Upright. And that becomes the basic text for Mussar for the next 100 years. So interestingly, while Mussar is developing, it's believed that the writings of Ben Franklin, our Benjamin Franklin from the United States, were circulating through Europe. And they had been for a while. Ben Franklin was wildly popular in Europe, particularly in Western Europe. But his ideas and his writings began to trickle through, moving into Central Europe and Eastern Europe. And so there's a thought that maybe some of Ben Franklin's writings found their way into the tiny shtetls of the Jewish community in Eastern Europe. And it was there that a very brilliant rabbi named Israel Salanter lived, and hugely respected man. And he saw that there was a particular practice, perhaps, we think, this is all speculation, that he saw that one of Ben Franklin's proposals was that you would take a trait, a quality of being, an ethical trait, and you would work on it specifically for a given period of time. And there was this, Ben Franklin had this idea that he could acquire moral perfection by focusing on his moral imperfections very intently. And so sure enough, Israel Salanter comes up with the study of Mussar, in which you take ethical traits, these ethical traits that have been laid out for centuries and centuries, and you would have a regular routine of practice that you could begin to work on your inner self. And Israel Salanter said this focus on inner self is the most important work you could do. And so this was a little bit in contrast to sort of what the other rabbis were focusing on. They were focusing more on the law. And Israel Salanter said, no, you have to study law in the same time that you are working on your inner life. And so Rabbi Salanter started some schools that were Mussar focused. Initially, it was intended for the older population, but his disciples decided this needed to be taught to very young kids. So they would start when they were young and grow up with this practice. It became extremely popular in Eastern Europe. It was spreading it started in Lithuania. It spread throughout Eastern Europe, was moving into Germany. There were schools all over Russia as well. And then, of course, between Stalin in the East and the Nazis in the West, as most of Jewish culture was being decimated, Mussar was a casualty of that as well. There were very few Mussar instructors that survived. One of them made it to the United States, and I believe another one or two made it to Israel. And that's sort of where the modern Mussar picks up from that point.
Wow, what an amazing history. And it's so interesting because I had been following some of Ben Franklin's, the legacy of his work with this. And there's an organization that shares what's called Ben Franklin Circles and these 13 virtues. And it's a way to invite people to come together in community around some of Ben Franklin's practices. I'll include a link in the show notes. But I had noticed so much symmetry. I'm so curious whether any of the Mussar practice actually influenced Ben Franklin.
It's possible. I mean, we don't know. I think it's hard for us to know how they trickled in and out of different people's worldviews. So yeah, it's a good question. I don't know.
Fascinating. Well, I think this would be a good segue because I still want to go deeper and understand this more. The I in EPIC stands for invested in ourselves. And I think making time for self-reflection and improvement and, connecting our mind and our body in the way that you've started to describe is one of the most powerful ways to invest in ourselves. Can you now share more about how one actually practices Mussar and how you've connected that to your yoga practice?
Yes. So Mussar, again, it's like this idea that Ben Franklin laid out. So we take a trait. In Hebrew, it's called a midah. It's an ethical trait, and we study it for either a week or 2 weeks, where we put all of our emphasis and attention on that particular trait. So we might start in the morning. You could start either, say, with a prayer in the morning or some kind of mantra to remind you to set up your day that this is what we're working on. And so, for example, you might, if you're working on the trait of equanimity, you might just kind of put a little reminder on your bathroom mirror even, just sort of as you're brushing your teeth, to remind yourself to find peace and calm throughout the day. And so it starts in the morning, or again, a prayer or a mantra of some kind. And then throughout the day, you're conscious and aware of how that trait is showing up for you. So for example, if you're working on not to keep switching around, but if you're working on the trait of truth, and somebody, you have somebody come to you and say, hey, what do you think of my new dress or I got these new shoes? And you just, let's say, your first reaction is that they're actually horrendous, that you really don't like it at all. You're kind of confronted, right? But I'm practicing truth this week. So what do I do here? Right. And then you begin to kind of work with that and sort of figure out, how can I be truthful, but also say be kind, or, how do I navigate this? And so we're always kind of holding on to this, keeping this awareness as we move through the day about our challenges at truth and the moments that we have success when we're called upon to navigate in between the truth and kindness. One of the things that's really interesting, what I love about Mussar, is that each trait is understood to be practiced most authentically and most healthily when you are in the middle of a continuum. So the classic example is humility, right? We need to find that right perfect amount of humility in between, say, arrogance and extreme insecurity. We would find, okay, what are our strengths? What are our weaknesses? The sense of being honest with ourselves so that we're riding that middle line. That when we feel confident, it's coming from an authentic place, that we are being true to our strengths. And when we're feeling insecure, it's, again, the same thing. Like we realize, I'm not so good at, I'm not really good at technology. And so I'm not trying to be falsely humble here, that I'm speaking the truth about my strengths and weaknesses and acknowledging my strengths and weaknesses.
So you're always coming to this trait with some self-reflection about where you are on that spectrum.
Exactly.
Or where you're pushing yourself to grow or to shift could be very different than the way in which somebody else is.
Absolutely. And then just to finish up, at the end of the day, there's a little bit of journaling where you reflect back on your day and check in. How did my practice of my trait for the day go? And that is really, it just creates a lot of insight. It's a wonderful practice because you begin to, I think that's maybe the most powerful part of it. You begin to reflect and see where you might need some more work or where you've begun to internalize the trait and that you're seeing some improvement. Like, before I would have just completely lied and told my friend that her dress was gorgeous, and I loved it. And now I found this time, without even having to blink, I just told her that she looked really pretty in it, or that it was very colorful, or I found some way to be positive without necessarily having to lie. So that's where I think the journaling at the end of the day comes in, is extremely powerful, that you can really reflect back and feel the impact of your work.
And how do you connect this to yoga and being in your body?
So again, the physical body, it gives you immediate feedback. And if you're really listening, you learn so much. You can learn, if you're paying attention, you can notice when you're stressed, when you're clenching muscles. You can notice when you're holding back and not putting in as much effort as you should, or when you're putting in too much effort. You can see, like, when you get physically uncomfortable, if you're paying attention, so you get into a physically uncomfortable place, what happens to you when you get physically uncomfortable? It's not going to be any different when you get physically uncomfortable as it is when you're emotionally uncomfortable or you're psychologically uncomfortable. It's all the same. So, like, for example, you might notice when you're physically uncomfortable, if you're in a yoga pose and it's challenging, you might notice, I get kind of mean. Like, I start to have angry thoughts. I start blaming other people for my discomfort. And then as you see that start to happen, you can begin to recognize a pattern and then begin to make changes to it. So I think the physical body is wonderful because, again, it gives you this immediate, tangible feedback. And it's like a little laboratory where you say, okay, what happens when I relax the body? What happens when I make it work really hard in my body? What happens with that connection with my mind, and my emotions? So that to me is where a lot of that really fruitful self-inquiry is going to happen, is that you, by tuning in and feeling on a physical level, what's going on.
And so the way that you ended up approaching this in your book is you have chapters for each of these 13 midot. And for each of them, you've also identified specific yoga poses that you think really connect to that trait.
Right. But they're not limited. In any single pose, you can practice any single trait. So I want to make that clear. So I just gave suggestions. This in particular is a good pose to do. It's been helpful for me in working on this trait. And so that's what's in the book. But if you have a regular yoga practice, and you can use if you go to a class, you can use the entire class to say, okay, I'm going to practice humility in class today. What's that going to look like? I'm not going to do any show-offy poses, or I'm going to maybe I need to try something that I've been afraid to try because I'm afraid if I fall, I'll embarrass myself. Again, you can use any trait in any pose.
So amazing. Well, the last guidepost in EPIC is C, which stands for connected, and that's about being in community on our journey. I know that community and learning together is also an important value within the Mussar practice. Can you share a little bit about, where you have found community in your life and in your yoga and Mussar, and how community is a part of the practice?
Right. So for me, Mussar has been a part of my community. I think my closest friends in Baltimore are the two people that I practice Mussar with, because we have a practice we connect every week or almost every week to just kind of run through how our week was. We sort of start out filling each other in on how life is going, and then we get into our Mussar practice. But Mussar is it is something that you are supposed to do with others, at least as it's been practiced for the past several hundred years. You hold each other accountable and you support each other, and it's nice to be going through it together, and we can share each other's insights. So
I'm hearing honking.
Yeah, so outside of my office, to me, it's always a reminder of the importance of like equanimity and compassion and sort of ethical behavior, because people get really frustrated at this intersection right outside my office. So whenever I hear honking, and then my office is above the intersection, so it kind of reminds me to sort of stay above the stress, that frustration. So anyway.
That honking was instructive.
Right, it was. It was reminding us that, the importance of peacefulness and engaging with other people in a positive way.
Yeah.
But yeah, so going back to your question about community is the way that we practice Mussar. And so we're practicing the trait of honor this week, honoring others. And there's all different ways of practicing this trait. And so when we meet to discuss this trait later on in the week, on Friday, we will share with each other how we each practiced it that week. And it's really helpful because there might be things that I found and discovered that the others didn't, and they might had an amazing experience and I learned something from them. And so really Mussar, I think, works best when you're doing it with others and people that you can count on and are reliable and give back. So
I think that's incredible that you do that. How many years have you been meeting with your Mussar partners to do this?
Our anniversary is coming up. We started it in the fall of 2010. So it's been 7 years.
Wow. And do you miss here or there, or do you find ways?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we get busy, people travel, especially in the summer, it gets a little bit lighter. But we're all in town and we can make it. There's a sense of obligation that we prioritize and make that call.
Fantastic. Well, we're getting close to the end of our time together. I always like to end with acknowledgments where we can both share what we've taken away and what the highlights are from the conversation. But before we do that, my guest also has the opportunity to give me a challenge or an offering. And this one's a little bit unique because you and I have co-created a challenge that we're going to be also inviting other people to be a part of in the Facebook group. So let's use this time just to share our common understanding of what we're going to create together.
Yeah, I'm super excited about this. So we as a group, so including the audience, we're going to pick a trait that we're going to work on for 5 days, starting the 25th and going through the 29th.
Yes. And so it does coincide with the Jewish holidays. So this conversation is going to be released on Rosh Hashanah, which is the Jewish New Year. And the challenge then is going to take us through until just, the last day will be the eve of Yom Kippur. And so in the Jewish tradition, Yom Kippur is the Day of Atonement. So it's a really great time in the Jewish tradition, but then as we were discussing at the beginning, really for anybody at this time of year, when school is beginning, when fall is here, to really bring some focused attention to our own selves and our personal growth. So the way it'll work is, first of all, hopefully you'll hear this conversation and there'll be some links and things you can begin to learn about. Also a link to your book, Edie, that I hope people will want to purchase because I think it'll be a great support. Beginning probably Sunday night in the Mother's Quest private Facebook group, which will include links to join in the show notes. You're going to give the night before of each day of the challenge, you're going to give us a prompt or something to think about or be aware or to practice. And then I'm going to commit to on that day, I'm going to be doing that challenge and sharing my personal reflections. And we'll also open it up to members of the group to share how it's showing up for you and what you're learning and noticing as you're moving through it. And as you mentioned, Edie, just before, we'll offer maybe 4 or 5 different potential traits that can be our focus for that challenge week. And we'll get some input and feedback from the group. We'll do a poll and see which one people are most excited to delve into. And then lastly, I'm also really excited that you are going to be able to join us live in the Facebook group on the Thursday of that challenge. So as we're already, almost will be 4 days into it, we can connect with you and hear from you more and ask you questions and just really be able to engage more fully in the practice together. So exciting.
It is. I'm really excited. I've never done anything like this before.
And then I do just also want to mention that you and I have decided that we want to partner up in the calendar new year. So in January, which is another time of introspection and new beginnings. And we're going to be planning a virtual workshop. So hopefully, if you can get a taste of this experience in this challenge in the Facebook group, and then we'll have a chance to come together in a really deep and meaningful way in January as well. So I feel like this conversation is really just the beginning of hopefully an ongoing partnership.
Yeah, a beginning of lots of beginnings.
Yes. I love that.
Because we were talking about how one of the themes of Mussar is that it's never too late to start again, right? So we'll have all different, we've got the Jewish New Year and the calendar New Year, and it reminds us that we always have opportunities to start with a clean slate and start over again.
Yes. So, that brings us to our closing reflections from this conversation. And I can start. One of my biggest takeaways is what you just named again about the ability to start anew. I love the premise of Mussar that, there are these 13 traits, but once you're done, you go back again because there's always place for new learning and getting to the next level. And I loved what you were sharing with me earlier too about, even when you're in the middle of the week and you notice, maybe your growth around this trait isn't happening the way that you would like it to, you can always start again. So I love that. Just focus on renewal and a fresh beginning. I also really appreciated all the things you shared about mindfulness in general, the ways in which you came to it, how you are able to be more present with your children and how you've seen them learn through your example. I'm inspired by the example of your own mom, and I'm so sorry for your loss, but I can see her independence and sort of forging a path that was meaningful to her, how that has shown up in you and your life. And then the last thing I think is just this connection between our physical body and our spiritual growth and the amazing way in which you've connected yoga to Mussar, which I look forward to practicing more. Thank you for all of that.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about Mussar. I think that, I've been practicing it, but when people ask me questions, it gives me a great opportunity to reflect back and to stop taking for granted what's just become an integral part of my life. And it helps me renew my commitment to the practice and to feel a sense of gratitude for the journey that I've been on, that it's taken me, and the growth that's happened and the hard work. So I'm grateful for being able to share this, because by sharing it, I've received so much as well.
Amazing. Well, so this really is just the beginning, the end of this episode, but the beginning of a lot that's to come in this exploration. So look forward to connecting with you soon as we embark on the challenge.
Wonderful.
Have a great day.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you so much for coming along with me on this episode of the Mother's Quest podcast. I hope this conversation sparked something that will help you live your epic life. If you'd like to get show notes and learn more about how to join the Mother's Quest community, head over to mothersquest.com. And while you're there, I would love it if you would follow the prompts to subscribe, leave a review on iTunes, and help us spread the word. I want to end with some words to light the way on your quest. Seize the day, love your people, honor your gifts. Until next time.